In December of 2018, a volcano in the Sunda Strait of Indonesia killed at least 437 people in a single night, with a tsunami that came without an earthquake and without any warning. That same volcano, Anak Krakatau, the child of Krakatoa, has spent the past 3 weeks stirring back to life, and it just sent up a gray ash plume. In the next few minutes, I'll show you why a plume this small is being treated this seriously, and exactly what scientists are watching for next. Over the past several days, a volcano in the Sunda Strait of Indonesia sent up a plume that, on its own, would barely register as news. It rose roughly 100 meters above the crater, about 330 feet, and drifted southwest across the water between Java and Sumatra. By the standard of large explosive eruptions, a column that small is almost nothing. If you measured this event by height alone, you would scroll right past it. But height is not what matters here, and the people who watched this volcano for a living were not looking at the size of the plume. They were looking at its color. The plume was gray. That single detail is the reason this story exists. When a volcano exhales a clean white plume, it is mostly water vapor, the ordinary breathing of a system letting off steam. When the plume turns gray, something else is happening. Gray means ash. Gray means fragmented rock is mixing into the column, and that material has to come from somewhere. A volcano producing a gray plume is not simply venting gas. It is moving solid material up and out of its crater, which tells you the system is active at very shallow depth, with fresh rock reaching the surface. On most volcanoes, a small gray plume would be a footnote. On this one, it is a signal worth stopping for. The volcano is named Anak Krakatau. The name means child of Krakatoa, and it is not a poetic flourish. This is the cone that grew inside the drowned crater left behind when its parent volcano, Krakatoa, tore itself apart in 1883, in one of the most violent eruptions in recorded human history. And this is the same volcanic system that, far more recently, killed hundreds of people in a single night in December of 2018, with a tsunami that arrived on crowded coastlines with no earthquake and no warning at all. So when this particular volcano starts producing gray plumes after weeks of unrest, the color is not a footnote. It is the opening line of a story this volcano has told before. The gray plume did not appear out of nowhere. It sat on top of nearly 3 weeks of escalating activity that, taken together, paint a consistent picture. In early June, satellites detected sulfur dioxide gas rising from the volcano, along with a renewed thermal anomaly, a patch of heat where there should not have been one. Around the 10th of June, a hotspot appeared in the crater. Then, on the 18th and 19th of June, the ground beneath the volcano began to move in a way that monitoring instruments take seriously. The number of shallow earthquakes rose sharply. And since the 26th of June, both the intensity of those quakes and the production of gray, ash-laden smoke have increased again. The kinds of earthquakes matter as much as the count, and this is where the investigative work happens. Scientists who monitor volcanoes do not just count tremors. They classify them because different signals come from different processes underground. Hybrid earthquakes typically occur when solid rock is fracturing at the same time that magma, gas, or hot fluids are forcing their way through the shallow parts of the volcano under rising pressure. Low-frequency earthquakes are the signature of fluids and gases moving through the volcanic plumbing, less like rock snapping and more like the rumble of something flowing through a pipe. And continuous tremor, rather than single discrete pops, means the volcano is vibrating over sustained stretches of time, which tells scientists something about the overall state of the system feeding the surface. The word shallow is doing a lot of work in that description, and it is worth slowing down on because shallow is the part that should get your attention. Volcanic earthquakes can occur at a range of depths, and when the activity is happening far down, it can mean magma is still low in the system, with a long way to travel before it does anything at the surface. When the earthquakes cluster at shallow depth, it means the action has moved close to the top, close to the crater, close to the open air. Combine shallow quakes with a gray ash plume and a fresh thermal hotspot, and you are no longer describing a volcano thinking about waking up somewhere far below in its plumbing. You are describing one that has fresh material right at the surface, venting it out into the sky. That is a meaningful step up from the slow background grumble that a volcano like this produces even on a quiet month. Put all of it together, and the pattern is internally consistent. You have gas, you have heat, you have shallow earthquakes of exactly the types associated with moving magma, and fluid, you have sustained tremor, and you have a plume that shifted from white to gray. Every one of those indicators points in the same direction, toward a volcano becoming more active near the surface. None of them, on its own, proves that a major eruption is coming. A single gray plume can fade by the weekend. But they do not contradict each other, and that convergence, several independent instruments all telling the same story at once, is what separates a genuine reactivation from the random noise a restless volcano makes all the time. Indonesia's Volcanological Authority has set the alert level at the second of 4 stages. In Indonesian, it is called waspada, which translates roughly to be on guard, an advisory level. A restricted zone 2 kilometers wide, about 1 2/10 miles, has been drawn around the active crater, and the public is told to stay out of it. It is worth being precise about what that level means and what it does not. Level 2 does not confirm that a catastrophic eruption is on the way. It does not say a disaster is imminent. What it says is that the system is active, that something is happening at shallow depth, and that it warrants close watching. My honest reading sits between 2 errors, and we will come back to both of them. To understand why a small plume on this volcano carries so much weight, you have to understand where it sits and what it is made of. Anak Krakatau is an island, a young volcanic island, standing in the SUNDA Strait, the stretch of water that separates the Indonesian islands of Java and Sumatra. It exists because of one of the planet's great collision zones. Here, the Indo-Australian plate is being forced down beneath the edge of the Eurasian margin along the Sunda Trench, a subduction zone that melts rock at depth and feeds the long chain of volcanoes running the length of Indonesia. This is part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, and Anak Krakatau is one of its most restless children. Because this is an island volcano standing in water within a narrow strait, its hazards are not only the ones you would picture from a mountain on land. Yes, it can throw ash, lava, and volcanic bombs upward, and it can send pyroclastic flows racing down its slopes. But part of its threat moves sideways and underwater. Material can slide off the flank of the cone into the sea. The structure itself can fail. And that introduces a category of danger that a purely terrestrial volcano simply does not have, which is the ability to move a large volume of seawater suddenly. The cone is also young, and it is loosely built. Since the collapse in 2018, which we will get to, the volcano has been actively rebuilding itself, stacking up a fresh cone of poorly consolidated volcanic rock from the scar left behind. That detail is not trivia. A cone made of loose, fragmented material, piling up on a steep slope that runs from above the waterline down into open water, is inherently more prone to failure than solid bedrock. Picture the difference between a hill carved out of granite and a pile of gravel poured onto a ramp. The granite holds. The gravel waits for a reason to slide. Under the loading of continued eruption, the pressure of magma pushing in from below, or strong shaking, a structure like that can give way. The volcano is quite literally reassembling the same unstable shape, in the same volatile spot, where its predecessor failed catastrophically. And that is the thread that ties the gray plume to the real danger. There is one more feature of this setting that amplifies everything. The slope does not stop at the shoreline. It continues underwater, dropping away beneath the surface, which means that when a piece of the cone fails, it does not just tumble onto a beach. It plunges into the sea and keeps going, dragging more loose material with it as it slides farther down beneath the surface. The volume of rock involved in a flank collapse can be far larger than what is visible above the waterline, and it is that submerged, sliding mass that does the real work of shoving the ocean aside. This is why a volcano that looks unremarkable from a boat can still be one of the most dangerous structures in the region. Most of the loaded gun is below the water, where no camera can see it and no casual observer would think to look. Here is the core of why scientists watch this volcano so closely, and it has almost nothing to do with how high an ash column climbs. The defining threat from Anak Krakatau is a chain reaction. It begins with an eruption. The eruption destabilizes the loosely built cone. A section of the flank collapses into the sea. That sudden collapse shoves a large volume of water out of the way all at once, and the result is a tsunami, generated not by an earthquake, but by a landslide of volcanic rock into the ocean. It is a tsunami with no fault rupture behind it, and that distinction is everything. Think about how most people understand a tsunami warning. When a great earthquake strikes a subduction zone, the ground shakes, often hard, often for minutes. That shaking is nature's alarm. It is the cue that has been drilled into coastal communities from the Indian Ocean in 2004 to Japan in 2011, the signal that says, move to high ground now. The shaking buys time, sometimes only minutes, but minutes that save lives. A volcanic flank collapse tsunami removes that alarm completely. The water can be displaced by a sudden structural failure with no significant earthquake at all. There is no long shaking, no obvious cue, nothing for the body to recognize as danger. The wave simply arrives. That is the warning problem, and it is the unresolved question this entire story circles. Is it possible to ever get ahead of a threat like this? Can the monitoring we just walked through, the shallow earthquakes, the gas, the thermal output, the deformation of the ground, give scientists enough lead time to anticipate a collapse before it happens? Or is the silent tsunami, by its very nature, a hazard that can strike faster than any warning system can respond? Those are not abstract questions, because this volcano has already run the experiment once with a real coastline and real people, And the result is the reason anyone is paying attention to a gray plume at all. In December of 2018, this exact chain of events unfolded. A major eruptive episode at Anak Krakatau caused a large section of the volcano's flank to collapse into the sea. The cone, built of that same loose, poorly consolidated rock, failed. The collapse displaced an enormous volume of water and sent a tsunami racing across the SUNDA Strait. And it did exactly what the science says this kind of event does. It arrived without a large earthquake. There was no long ground shaking to warn anyone. The people on the coast had no reason, in the moment, to run. It happened at night, which made everything worse because people could not see the water coming. It was the holiday season, and the beaches and coastal resorts of Banten on Java and Lampung on Sumatra were full. The waves struck communities that were near the water precisely because it was a time for being near the water. At least 437 people were killed. More than 14,000 were injured. Tens of thousands were displaced from their homes. On the small islands nearest the volcano, inside the Krakatau complex itself, the water ran up the land to heights exceeding 80 meters, more than 260 feet, an extraordinary figure that reflects how close those islands sit to the collapse and how local geography can focus a wave. On the populated coasts of Java and Sumatra, the waves reached up to about 13 meters, roughly 43 feet. It is worth pausing on what those numbers mean, because the human mind tends to picture tsunamis as towering walls of water and dismiss anything smaller. The reality is that even a small wave is deadly. A wall of moving water, just 1 meter high, and in some circumstances less, can kill. A wave only 3 feet tall can knock a grown adult off their feet and drown them. The reason is that a tsunami is not a single cresting wave like the ones surfers ride. It is the ocean itself rising and surging inland with the full weight of moving water behind it. And that water keeps coming, pushing debris, vehicles, and structures along with it. The coastal waves of 2018 were several times that lethal threshold, and they came in the dark, unannounced. The aftermath in 2018 also exposed how unprepared the region was for a tsunami that broke the rules. Warning systems in this part of the world had been built and rebuilt around earthquakes, around the assumption that the ground would shake first and buy everyone a few precious minutes. When the wave came with no earthquake behind it, that entire assumption failed. Some coastal communities reported feeling nothing at all before the water arrived. Others described confusion, people standing on the beach watching the sea behave strangely without any framework to understand what they were seeing. That gap between the threat and the warning is the single most important thing the 2018 disaster taught. And it is the reason the unrest of the past several weeks is being treated with the seriousness it is. This is the precedent that transforms today's modest gray plume from a curiosity into something worth watching, because the current monitoring exists for exactly one purpose, to try to see the next one coming before it arrives. And there is another reason this specific volcano commands that kind of attention, which is the name it carries and the catastrophe it was born from. The parent volcano, Krakatoa, exploded in August of 1883, and it remains one of the most violent volcanic events in recorded human history. The eruption destroyed roughly 2/3 of the original island. The northern part of it collapsed beneath the sea, leaving behind the drowned crater, the caldera, that the present volcano grows inside today. The ash column climbed to something like 80 kilometers, nearly 50 miles, into the sky. The explosion was heard thousands of kilometers away, one of the loudest sounds ever documented, and the atmospheric pressure waves it generated circled the entire planet, registering on instruments around the world. The death toll from 1883 was around 36,000 people, and here is the detail that connects directly to everything we have been discussing. The great majority of those deaths did not come from ash or from the blast itself. They came from tsunamis. The largest waves recorded in the bays nearby reached about 41 meters, roughly 135 feet. The lesson of 1883, the same lesson written into 2018, is that the killer in this place has almost always been the water, not the fire. That is why a volcano that rebuilds itself inside the collapse crater of a catastrophe like that one is watched with a seriousness that a small gray plume would not otherwise earn. It is just as important to be honest about scale, because this is where a lot of online discussion goes wrong. The 1883 eruption is classified as a 6 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, which scientists describe with the word colossal. People sometimes attach the word supervolcano to Krakatoa, and that is simply a mistake. A true super eruption, an 8 on that index, involves more than 1,000 cubic kilometers of erupted material, roughly 240 cubic miles. 1883, devastating as it was far smaller than that. And the most important point hiding inside that correction is this. The real danger of the system has never required a super eruption to do its damage. The tsunami that killed hundreds in 2018 was produced by a comparatively small collapse, not by a colossal blast. The threat does not need to be enormous to be lethal. It only needs to move the water. Whenever a famous volcano stirs, a predictable set of theories spreads online, and they deserve a direct answer rather than a polite silence. One claim holds that unrest like this is deliberately triggered by some kind of technology, a directed energy weapon or an atmospheric heating system. There is no physical mechanism by which any human technology could inject magma into a volcano or drive the engine of a subduction zone. The energy involved in moving molten rock dwarfs anything our machines can supply, by an almost unimaginable margin. Anak Krakatau's activity is a textbook expression of the SUNDA arc, monitored in real time by instruments measuring earthquakes, gas, and ground movement. A second claim says authorities are hiding an imminent mega eruption. The reality is the opposite of concealment. The published alert level and the marked exclusion zone are themselves the open communication of risk. And a third claim links solar storms or space weather to eruptions, for which there is no established causal connection to magma movement. The genuine danger here is well documented, and it does not require any hidden or exotic cause to be frightening. So where does that leave the assessment, honestly stated? It sits deliberately between two errors. The first error is to minimize, to wave this off as just steam, just a tiny plume, nothing to see. The volcano's own history makes that complacency inappropriate. The second error is to catastrophize, to treat a 100-meter ash plume and a level 2 alert as proof that an 1883 scale eruption or an immediate flank collapse is bearing down on the strait. Nothing in the current data supports that either. The correct posture is the one the scientists have taken. It is vigilance, not panic. This is a real escalation from background activity, occurring on the one volcano that has already proven twice over what this exact chain of events can do. That is precisely why it is being watched so carefully and why the watching is the story. The honest answer to what happens next is that nobody knows, and the people closest to the data are the first to say so. What they can tell you is exactly what they are watching for, the specific signals that would shift the assessment from advisory towards something more serious. They are watching whether the ash columns grow larger, stronger, or more sustained. They are watching whether the continuous tremor intensifies and whether the low-frequency and hybrid earthquakes become more frequent. They are watching for visible incandescent lava at the crater, for measurable swelling or deformation of the ground that would suggest magma pushing the structure toward instability, and for any decision to raise the official alert level. A change in any one of those would move the needle. What makes this moment genuinely worth your attention is that it is a live test. The disaster of 2018 exposed a brutal gap in how we protect coastlines, a kind of tsunami that strikes without the earthquake that everyone is trained to recognize. In the years since, the question has been whether the lessons of that night could be turned into a monitoring system capable of seeing the next collapse before it happens. The reactivation unfolding right now, the great plume, the shallow quakes, the tremor, is the system being put on alert in real conditions. Whether it can ever provide enough warning for a hazard this fast is the unresolved question that hangs over the entire SUNDA Strait. For now, the practical reality is straightforward, and it is not cause for alarm. The exclusion zone around the crater is in force for a reason, and it should be respected. The alert sits at level 2, not higher. The plume is small, the activity is shallow, and the situation is being monitored closely by people whose entire job is to catch the moment it changes. The thing to understand is why a plume this modest is being treated this seriously, and now you do. It is not the height of the column that matters. It is the volcano underneath it, the coastlines around it, and the history written into both. We will know more in the coming days and weeks, and we will be watching the same signals the scientists are.